Welcome, Liza Libes. You're joining me today to talk about your writing and your project at Pens and Poisons. You're a fellow Substack writer. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. We've had this wonderful little dialogue over the internet about 100 books to read before you die, which has
Sure.
been quite fun. But before we get into that, maybe can you just tell us a little bit about your story and how your literary project Pens and Poisons really got off the ground? Because it's quite an interesting story about the age-old debate about whether literature is about politics or about art.
I love literature. That's where this whole thing started. I got to college at Columbia University about 10 years ago.
Hmm.
And I was just really excited to study literature. I think that I went to maybe a more STEM oriented high school. I did a lot of work with kind of math and science. So I found that that was maybe a little bit not exactly what I wanted to do. I was very excited to come to Columbia, and obviously Columbia has a really, really great books program, allegedly. And that was actually one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Columbia, is because of this famous core curriculum where, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically a full cultural immersions. You take 1 year of the great books of literature, you take 1 year of kind of philosophy and history and political philosophy, and then you take 1 semester of music history and 1 semester of art history. So I'm very much a fan of the idea that, literature is not an isolate field. It is very much intertwined with, music and culture and philosophy and history and all of these things. So I really loved this approach that Columbia had, and that's one of the primary reason I would say that I decided to go to Columbia. And when I got there, it was very different from what I had expected, which I guess what I had expected was a course that would teach me the course at Columbia is called the Masterpieces of Western Literature. So obviously there was a lot with Western literature in terms of, what I was going to do there. And it's still that course is still there, but the year I got there was a really big debate about Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Hmm.
And that was a work that was taken off the syllabus. And I was a
Okay.
little bit curious about that particular decision, because to me, the Metamorphoses is kind of the foundational text of understanding any great work of literature, right? So, especially if you're interested in Shakespeare, right?
Mhm.
Maybe half of Shakespeare plays will draw on Greek myths in some capacity, right? Very famously, in the Midsummer Night's Dream. I think, I'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe I don't want to go too much on a
Yeah, yeah,
tangent, but Midsummer Night's Dream, has the famous kind of Pyramus and Thisbe scene at the end. So that's, drawn directly from the Metamorphoses. And we know that Shakespeare had a copy of the first English translation of the Metamorphoses by Arthur Golding. And so we know he read the Metamorphoses. We know that that was a really big influence on him. And the structure of the Metamorphoses also influenced Chaucer, most likely Boccaccio as well, right? So this was a book that, to me, without having read the Metamorphoses, it's very difficult to understand the kind of progression of great literature from there. So it was a very strange decision, because I didn't really understand why they'd taken it off, and I thought that whole decision didn't really make any sense. So I started to probe into, why this decision was made by the committee for the core, and it turned out that, some students had complained that there were not ample, trigger warnings, because in the Metamorphoses, obviously, you have Zeus, and a lot of the stories are about he'll go out, he'll rape a woman, basically. The most famous one is, the Leda story, right? Where he turns Leda into a swan. Leda turns into a swan after Zeus basically rapes her, and a lot of students were upset about this, and there was a petition going around, get rid of the metamorphoses because it's offensive to people. And so, committee decided, okay, we're gonna nix it. It's a bad work of literature. And to me, this seemed completely reductive, and I was very upset at this decision. Not even from I had read the Metamorphoses in high school. In high school, I just sort of sat around and read for fun. But I was learning Latin just to read the Metamorphoses and obviously other great Latin works. But I ended up reading the Metamorphoses in Latin. My Latin is very bad now, but back then, like 10 years ago, I could read it in Latin, and it's great. I think it's just one of the most beautiful things ever written. Like, just the opening pages are just so rich with kind of metaphor, and the Latin. Ovid is a complete master of the Latin literary language. So I started to look into, okay, well, why are these sorts of more petty considerations encroaching on the study of great literature? And what I found was that so much of how students at Columbia University approached literature, and professors as well to some extent, was that a work of literature was only great insofar as it either commented on some political aspect of the times, or told us something about the nature of let's say, some ism like racism or sexism and all of this. Right? So I thought that was a very reductive way of studying literature. I think one can argue that there certainly is, racism and sexism in literature, and you can read Othello and read it as a text about race relations. Fine, but that's maybe not. That's missing so much of Othello. Right. So I think it's a little bit of a reductive way of studying literature. Right. So, and whenever I would bring this up to people at Columbia, they would just sort of look at me like I was crazy. Right? Especially in my courses, I found that I would get good grades when I wrote something like more on the political side of things. And then if I wrote something a little bit less political, then I would get lower grades. So I found that there was this kind of predominant discourse that you needed to use when you talk about literature. And I got so fed up with it. I was doing my master's, intending on going on to then get a PhD and become an English professor, because that is what I love to do the most. And after finishing my master's, and I graduated during COVID, so it gave me a little bit of time to think. I decided I wasn't going to continue to pursue literature at the PhD level, because I couldn't stomach any more of this kind of political ideology that was embedded in literature. And I spent a couple years just kind of fully removed from the literature world, because I was just a little bit, I guess, traumatized by what I had gone through and some of the reactions to just a lot of my ideas. And about a year ago, I said, well, I'm still trying to become a writer. I need to kind of get back to the literary world. So I started my Substack, and I started doing also some work on social media as well, like YouTube, Instagram. And I just really wanted to create a platform, create a space where people who also believed that literature was not inherently a political project could read about, what was going on in the literary world today, what's maybe going on in publishing. I talk about publishing a lot as well, because it's the same problem in publishing, right? Academia, publishing, same cohort of people typically, right? So that was, sort of how my Pens and Poisons started, because I really wanted to get at the core of what was going on, and just to expose a little bit of, why why literary study has become what it is today.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, obviously I'm a little bit older than you, but or a lot older than you, and and like my recollections go back to like the universities in the 1980s, and it was probably the height of like Paul de Man and Harold Bloom and all that sort of stuff. So there was certainly and the book about the closing of the American mind, which I can't remember who wrote it now.
Alan Bloom.
Alan Bloom, that's right. And, so there was the emergence of this kind of thing, but it really does seem to have, intensified a lot over the last couple of decades as well. And there has long been this sort of debate of, is literature for art, life, or politics? And I guess, it's a bit sad in a way that the academia has become this sort of, it's sort of a lot about the academic status, it seems to me, and positioning within that sort of market for the teachers. But good on you for succeeding with your Substack, etc. And what's your, I think I heard you say you're kind of from a post-Soviet sort of family background somewhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I can talk a little
How
bit
does
about
that all play within your response to this kind of?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously my parents fled communism. So we are not fans of communism in my household, because we have lived through it. Or I personally obviously haven't, but I've heard stories from my parents, from grandparents especially, about how the communist system basically repressed literature, art, and all of these things. My grandmother was telling me a couple of weeks ago about the kind of the time that in the Soviet Union, I think it was in the 60s, where there was like a showing of kind of newer artwork that didn't go along with the socialist realist style, and then they just took a bunch of paintings and had a bunch of like bulldozers run over every single work of art that was at this exhibit. So that was what happened in the Soviet Union. Obviously that was covered up so that just kind of your ordinary Soviet citizen wasn't made aware of what was going on. But because there was so much repression in the art world, when my parents and grandparents came to the US, they were just very surprised at the amount of great art, literature, music, even that they hadn't been exposed to in the Soviet Union, because, so-and-so author had capitalist sympathies, right? If you look at the foreign literature that was disseminated in the Soviet Union, the foreign literature that my parents and grandparents are familiar with, it's like John Galsworthy, Jack London, let's say who else, Dreiser, right? So names that we would know them, but they're not maybe the most famous of British and American literature, right? And the reason that London, Galsworthy, and Dreiser were being read in the Soviet Union is because each of them were socialists or liked the Stalin regime for whatever reason, right? So that literature was basically about who believed what. And when I got to Columbia, there wasn't the same sort of just full-on censorship, but there was the same dynamic of, we are going to judge the literary work based on what the author believed, right? And I know you had wanted to ask about T.S. Eliot, which we'll talk about in a second, but I had a professor, I took a class that was called Yeats, Eliot, and Auden at Columbia with this professor named, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Mendelssohn. And he's the literary executor of the Auden estate. So he's kind of the prime Auden authority in the world. And he liked Yeats. I liked the kind of Yeats and Auden segment of the course. He's a smart guy. But then we got to Eliot, and he basically said, well, we're not going to read the four quartets, because by the time Eliot gets to the four quartets, he's so conservative that it's not, his writing gets bad. That was his take on the four quartets, and the four quartets obviously are a lot more kind of religious than sort of early Eliot in the Wasteland, right? So this professor he didn't want to teach the four quartets because he thought that they were bad, because they were based on Christianity, right? So it was that sort of thinking that I found was almost parallel to the sort of thinking that was taught in the repressive Soviet Union, that really, really bothered me, because an author was judged based on what they believed and, what their maybe like racial or cultural background was. And I just don't think that that's an appropriate way of thinking about literature. And so I, wanted to just provide a little bit of insight into what was going on.
It's a nice little bridge to your definitive list of 100 books to read before you die. No doubt definitive, little bit tongue-in-cheek, no, I sensed, but because one of the books on that list is Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which, was written, I guess, in the Stalin years, in perhaps the worst of the Stalin years, in the Soviet Union, and wasn't published until, the sort of the 1960s thaw. But it was one of the books that you put on the list after someone said it was, not worthy of inclusion in a similar list of 100 books to read. What do you love about and maybe what prompted you to write your list of 100 books to read before you die, and how does it relate to that story about Bulgakov?
There was a list that I think someone had sent it to me, or maybe it just popped up in my Substack feed. I can't remember exactly, but it was someone had written a list of books. Basically, I think they had taken maybe the modern library's 100 books list and then sorted it into like, these are the good ones and these are the bad ones. And on that list, the bad ones were basically all of my favorite books that I think are very, very important. Faulkner, he didn't like Faulkner for some reason. Bulgakov was not on there either. Master Margarita was not on there. There might have been a couple of other ones, but I think those were the two that just fully stood out to me, because those books had made my top 10 books of all time: The Sound of the Fury and The Master Margarita. And so I got very angry at this list, and I said I have to write my own list because this list is bad. And then on the good books, he had put a lot of the books that I didn't like, that I think are maybe less valuable. And I wrote the list because, to me, I think it's important once again to have the conversation of, there are great books of literature that have nothing to do with an author's identities, right? And I think they had maybe Giovanni's Room, which is, I think, the one book that I have no conception of why people read that book. I've read it twice because I was like, maybe I missed something the first time. I don't get it. This is maybe just my personal opinion, but my hypothesis is that the only reason that people read that book is because of the author's, Baldwin's identities. And Baldwin's a good writer, but I don't know that particular book is so worthy of literary greatness. Okay, so I wrote the book. I wrote the list just based on what I had read, what I had written about a lot of these books. And to answer your question about Master Margarita, I think it is, first of all, it's remarkable that book was even published, and it's very acute critique of the Soviet regime without being very upfront about it. It's very much a tacit critique, right? And there's kind of layers of understanding that you have to really understand what is being critiqued. But I think it was the first book that got me interested in kind of Christian myths, Christian
Hmm.
theology, maybe, from a literary perspective, and how a lot of maybe the texts in the New Testament have influenced literature because I'm Jewish, so I
Hmm.
have never really read the new. I've now read the New Testament. At the time, I had no exposure to anything in the New Testament whatsoever, and so all of a sudden, I read Master Margarita. It was the first serious book I read in Russian, actually. So
Mm.
reading it in Russian, I'm like 14, 15 years old, and there's all this stuff about like Pontius Pilate and
Hmm.
the story of the crucifixion, and I was like, what does this have to do with what's going on in Soviet Russia? And obviously, the Soviets were not big fans of religion, so I think that it's such an important book in terms of understanding, first of all, kind of the nature of religion in the Soviet Union. I think it talks a lot about that. Um, I think that I like the sort of magical realism in it. I think that was a fun touch that also you don't really see in a lot of maybe Russian works of literature. So
Mm.
I think that it's a very interesting commentary while also being a fun read. And it's one of those books. I think what makes a great work of literature great is that you can, or what separates maybe a great work of literature from a just a like a political work of literature is you can read The Master and Margarita and still enjoy it without knowing anything about the Soviet Union.
Mm.
And I think that's what there's. It's obviously cultural commentary, but it goes beyond even what um, what is just fully political. So there's so much going on that I don't know. I think it's a book that everyone should read.
Yeah, excellent. And it certainly it was also included in my list as well. And I did get a few reactions from a couple of people who said, "Oh, why is this on the list?" kind of thing. But it's interesting too because I mean I never really formally studied literature. I've read obviously a lot of literature, but I studied as a historian and I guess still in a way funny sort of way practice as a writer on history. But for me, often literature is a sort of a way into understanding history as well, but not in the way you describe with wanting to reduce everything to racism or whatever, or attitudes that the current present doesn't really approve of. But it's a great way to sort of say, well, you read Master Margarita and you get very curious about, well, what is this society that Mikhail Bulgakov's responding to, and the culture, and how many more possibilities are there than perhaps you might imagine if with a sort of limited image of the past. But yeah, absolutely. What were some of your other favourites on your list of 100 books to read before you die?
I think my all-time favorite book is The Sound of the Fury, which
Hmm.
the original writer didn't like that book, which I can see. I can maybe understand why in terms of its kind of readability, but uh, I think the Quentin section of The Sound of the Fury is one of the most engaging, profound character studies that's ever been written in literature. And the reason I love it so much is, for those not familiar with The Son of the Fury, it's written in the kind of classic Faulkner stream of consciousness style. It's divided into four sections. The first section is told by a kind of mentally retarded, if I can use that word in the original sense, basically a 30-year-old man who has the brain of like a
Intellectually
7-year-old.
disabled, or
Right.
whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the term. That's the politically correct term that I was looking for. Right. So okay. So and you open the book and you have no idea what's going on. The can't remember the exact first sentence, but I think it was something like they on the golf course, like on the course they were hitting. That's not it. It's something about hitting, right? And so you realize like about a couple pages in that he's talking about there's this golf course, right? So you're thrown into the brain of a 30-year-old man who thinks like a 7-year-old. And first of all, to execute that as a writer, I think you have to be brilliant, right? And you don't really know what's going on for the first 70 pages until you get to the other sections told by some of the adults, right? And then you start to piece together some of what Benji, this initial character, is referring to. And I think the second chapter, the Quentin chapter, right? So he talks, his biggest, I guess, problem in life is he has this obsession with his sister Caddy's purity, right? So he's very upset that his sister Caddy, around I think age 16, 17, is starting to have sexual relationships, and this just bothers him to no end. And he's sort of obsessed with this idea of like Southern purity, like Southern more. So he almost, because he becomes so obsessed, the book almost becomes like incestuous, and Faulkner likes to write about incest. That's one of his big topics. And it's just, it's so brilliant to kind of get into the mind of a character who thinks like this. And I think that I think he's 19 at the time of The Sound and the Fury. He's at Harvard. And at the end, well, okay, fine, I won't spoil it. He goes through a lot of like mental struggles, and you see through language Faulkner is able to capture a lot of what is in Quentin's mind. And I think Quentin is one of my favorite like literary characters of all time. I went to Boston a couple months ago, and the purpose of my trip to Boston was there's a plaque over the Charles River at Boston, like in real life, and it's dedicated to the memory of Quentin. And I think that's one of the coolest things ever in the world. Because I flew to Boston just to find this plaque, and we searched for it for like an hour and finally found it. But
it's a bit like Bloomsday,
yeah. It's one of those. And yeah, I think that he's probably one of the most interesting characters I've ever written. He then turns up again in Absalom, which is Faulkner's other kind of big stream of consciousness novel, which I think is my second favorite Faulkner novel, which is a little bit more about the generational demise of this family that Faulkner likes to write about in his famous county that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce.
Yeah, I remember doing a podcast about it and sort of struggled with the pronunciation.
I won't pronounce it. So
and what's also interesting about your list is some of the ones that you leave off the list as well. What's perhaps one of the more controversial books that you said definitely not in the canon? Sure.
So I will first address my list and say, I'll preface it by saying that I purposely left off plays and books written in poetic meter, because I said that I left that off because I don't think it's a fair comparison. First of all, I would probably have like 20 slots filled up by Shakespeare. So I said, okay, well, we're not doing that. Second of all, I didn't think it was appropriate to maybe lump like Chaucer into the same category as like, let's say Frankenstein, right? So, I did leave off, I think most of my list were, and the list is called List of Classic Novels, right? Most of my list are works that we think of as novels, right? So there's a bunch of books that I would also put on in terms of great works of literature to read that I just didn't want to put on here. In terms of novels that I left off, I think a lot of people were upset at The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know. I actually saw Margaret Atwood. She came to Chicago, where I'm located now, and she gave a book talk on her new book of poems out. And I don't like her. she spent the whole book talk. It was supposed to be about her poetry. She spent the whole book talk. This was like October 2024, right? So she spent the whole book talk talking about how Trump was evil. And I was like, this is basically my issue with what's going on, is that she's not talking about literature. She's just fully talking about politics. And then she basically was saying that, Trump was going to create the Handmaid's Tale, which is fine, but that's not why you're there to speak. And she read maybe one of her poems, right? And this was like talk like an hour and a half. So I think that angle, I don't like the Handmaid's Tale. I think it's a little bit too. There are some apocalyptic works that are great. I don't think her particular like worldview, right? And it's so much of literature is it's an author projecting their worldview. So I don't agree with her worldview. I don't think it's certainly an original book. I just don't think it's maybe particularly well written either. I don't like her style. I'm very particular about the style that I like. So that was one controversial pick that I had. Another one was I don't like Virginia Woolf. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I have no. I can't quite explain it in the same way that I can explain Margaret Atwood. I know what I don't like about her. When I read a great work of literature, I walk away from it. I'm touched. A lot of times I will physically cry. It will move me to tears, right? And I think that's what great literature does. I'm reading Buddenbrooks right now. I'm about halfway through it. I've already cried twice. I'm upset. I'm at right now. I'm at the point in Buddenbrooks where Tony is she's realized that she's been betrayed, right, by her husband, or she didn't like her husband to begin with, right? But he basically lied his way into this marriage. And I was upset I'm upset at this book. I'm upset about her father for kind of. I just got to the point where the father dies, but I was upset at her father, right, for pushing her into this marriage. And then she had this kind of like whole like summer fling with like Wharton, right? So I'm so invested in this book. I love this book. And so to me, and this book takes place in mid 19th century Germany, right? It's not anything that I'm particularly familiar with, but great works of literature are timeless and they should have kind of something for everyone, right? So I think that, to me, I love Buddenbrooks for so far. I haven't finished it yet, but I'll get to it. Virginia, I don't know what it is about Virginia Woolf. I read Mrs. Dalloway. I read To the Lighthouse. I've read parts of Room of One's Own. Just I don't know. I've never been really moved by her. Certainly, once again, her language is great, and I like obviously Faulkner's Stream of Consciousness. I think I was bored by Mrs. Dalloway To the Lighthouse. Maybe I'm missing something, but again, compared to other great works of literature, I don't quite think that she aspires, in my opinion. And then I guess the last one that maybe people were upset about was, a lot of people were upset about Blood Meridian.
Now,
I think that's
Blood Meridian?
Personal opinion.
I didn't recognize Blood. What is Blood Meridian? I didn't recognize
Cormac McCarthy.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, so a lot of people are upset. I think because Blood Meridian is a very like male book, and I have a big male audience. My audience is like 70% male, 30% female, because whatever. Because I tend to be maybe a little bit more conservative leaning in what I write, and that just whatever attracts males. Fine. So a lot of people are upset about Blood Meridian. Once again, it's not a book. It's a book about, I think that the kind of literary point of Blood Meridian is it's very violent, and it's able to portray violence in kind of beautiful language. It sort of accomplishes the same thing that maybe Lolita accomplishes, but it accomplishes something. It portrays something very vile and disgusting with beautiful language, right? If you read Lolita, it's a very beautiful book, even though the subject matter is repulsive. Same thing with Blood Meridian. That said, I don't know. I just didn't. I didn't get it.
Yeah.
And I think it's a book where the plot is very much like war centered,
Mm.
and I think maybe it was just the plot, and I didn't get it. So a
Yeah.
lot of these takes are obviously subjective, right? And I think any
Yes, totally.
sort of literary list is going to be subjective, but I think that I definitely think Virginia Woolf is overrated. I also think Toni Morrison is overrated. But again, these are just my personal opinions.
Yeah, that's that. Well, I mean, it's also, what resonates with you to
Sure.
some degree as well, isn't it? Like, I mean, Virginia Woolf's very, sort of Faye Bloomsbury group sort of perspective on the world, and quite a few people responded to my list by saying, Cormac McCarthy, and listed about half a dozen books of Cormac McCarthy, none of which I have read, and I guess my only encounter with Cormac McCarthy was watching the film The Road, and it's one of the only films I've ever watched where I actually felt kind of physically sick almost after watching the film, and I actually had to go. It was back in the days when there were video shops, and I went out and borrowed a video to watch a different film to sort of get it out of my system. So. With my list, I was a little bit less disciplined than you in terms of sticking to, a genre, partly because,
Sure.
I didn't want to, over sweat it. I guess I was making a conscious thing because one of the themes of my sort of work is really, sort of globalization, multipolar world, literature, cultures from other parts of the world. Were there any particular ones on my list that really stood out to you that if you ever had a chance to revise your definitive list, you would include?
I think most of the books that I think I would have included, I just haven't read yet. So I think
Yeah.
that's maybe some of the disconnect. Like I think, gosh, I can't remember the title in English. Because it's a Russian book. The Sholokov. The
Oh, yeah.
quiet flows
Quiet
of
Flows
dawn.
of Dawn.
Okay, in Russian it's
Yeah.
Tikhi Dawn. So I know that book is Tikhi Dawn in Russian, right? So that's a book that I will read. That is on my shelf.
Yeah.
I'm sure that it's going to make it on my list because I've heard great things. I think so once again, a lot of the books I haven't read. There were a lot of books that once just didn't fit my strict novel criteria that I would have
Yeah.
included, like Waiting for Godot. I
Mm.
loved Waiting for Godot, fantastic.
Yeah.
Right, so a lot of those I think maybe we more or less agree. Life and Fate I also have not yet read. I saw that on your list. Those are the two I think great works of Russian literature that I still
Yeah.
need to get to, and then some of the I guess non-Western
Mm.
books. I just haven't read as much
Yeah.
non-Western literature in my life thus far. So I think I'm just trying to read as much Western lit, and then I will expand as I get older.
Yeah, well, good on you. Good on you. Well, there's many years before you die, I'm sure, Lisa. So,
We have time.
lots of time to read. But you've also made a wonderful list of, I can't quite remember, it was 100 poems,
Poems,
or
that's
100
right.
best poems. And in them, of course, which I'm going to do my own version of, which will be fun as well. But in them, you include, some T.S. Eliot poems, obviously. And we talked a little bit about T.S. Eliot, but, what do you love about T.S. Eliot?
Yeah, so
Because he was a bit of a crappy old bastard in some ways,
that's right.
wasn't he?
That's right.
You
He
can
also
see
tended,
why people might not like him, but
sure. I think maybe he wouldn't like me personally,
yeah.
because he didn't like Jews.
Mm.
Although I actually have on my list of essays to write, I have a essay called "How Anti-Semitic Was T.S. Eliot Really?"
Mm.
And so I'm gonna do some research into that and maybe attempt to answer that question that's been attempted to answer by a lot of people. I think there are kind of two camps of T.S. Eliot beliefs. One camp thinks that he's very anti-Semitic. The other camp thinks that he wasn't personally anti-Semitic. There are just maybe some anti-Semitic stereotypes that appear in his poems. So, I haven't looked into that particular angle of his work yet, but I will. It's on my list. So, anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But in terms of poems on my list, no, sorry, the question was about T.S. Eliot. Yes. So I think the story of how I came to T.S. Eliot was I had this English teacher in the 7th grade. So I was 12 years old, and we did this thing every Friday morning where we would come in and he would introduce a new poem of the week, and it was called Poetry Friday. And I think this is just really what kickstarted my love of poetry. And we read so many of the great poems on my list we read in that English class. And I fell in love with poetry from there. And sort of towards the end of the year, I was talking to him and I was like, whatever, I'm a little 12-year-old kid who was excited about poetry. And I asked him about what other poems would you recommend that I read? And my teacher said that probably one of his favorite poems, one of the most profound poems ever written, is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. And he said, don't read it yet, you're not going to understand it. And the precocious 12-year-old that I was, I decided I was going to read The Wasteland. I read it, I guess, the summer before the 8th grade. And I understood, as he had predicted, very little of it, but I thought it was very pretty. And I had this goal. I was going to come back and I was going to reread The Wasteland. And when I had a little bit more of knowledge under my belt, I read it towards the end of high school. And I really loved it. Around that time, I also read Prufrock, Portrait of a Lady. And I don't know at what point, I think I wasn't a big T.S. Eliot fan until I would say early college. I don't remember exactly at what point I loved T.S. Eliot. I think it was, I remember one of the first poems I read very seriously of T.S. Eliot was his Portrait of a Lady. I really loved, he wrote it when he was like 20 years old. Right. I really loved the sort of story there of this kind of young man. He's trying to befriend this older woman and it doesn't really work out. And it's about a lot of things, but I think one of the big themes there is just kind of the maybe like impossibility of friendship. Right. So I really loved that poem by T.S. Eliot. And then I came back to The Wasteland again for a third time halfway through my freshman year. And here I remember a very clear memory of doing this. I had got the like Norton annotated edition and I sat through and I went through all of the like references, and it took me probably like a month to like sit through and like really read the poem while reading all the notes and going through some of the sources that Eliot cites. He has some excerpts from the Divine Comedy. He has some excerpts from Wagner operas. He has some maybe like more popular songs that he's excerpting in there. So a lot of, he has a Baudelaire poem, right? So a lot of the kind of intellectual challenge of The Wasteland is understanding a lot of the allusions that Eliot is making. And to me, that was like almost like a puzzle, right? I was really excited to go through and see how understanding some of these allusions that he was making helped me understand the poem overall. You can, once again, it's a poem that you can read just for its beauty without understanding the references. But then if you also have the allusions and some of these other poems that he's referencing, you get another layer of understanding of the poem. So that, I think it was the intellectual challenge of The Wasteland that really drew me to Eliot. And then the kind of central theme of The Wasteland is, right, barrenness, right? So he goes through and he talks about kind of barren London, right? The unreal city. And part of what he concludes in The Wasteland is that we need to turn a little bit towards just kind of, that's kind of like almost like carpe diem philosophy. And he cites actually Eastern myths to get there. So it's almost like a rebirth of Western, the Western world by like turning to the East. And I thought that was actually a really fascinating
Mm,
idea. And a big part of, again, the wasteland is this barrenness and this idea of childbirth. I think that also really
mm,
resonated with me, and especially the kind of inability for people to form relationships. And
mm,
I saw that as kind of just a big theme
mm,
around me, especially at Columbia. So that, him writing 100 years ago just really resonated with me in
mm.
terms of what was going on. So, I think Eliot's kind of take on the modern world and human relationships is what really draws me to him.
Yeah. Eliot's interesting, isn't he? Because like, we tend to fossilize these sort of writers from, who are seen as canonical. But as you say, like, Eastern literature, the Upanishads, all that sort of stuff
Yeah.
is very significant for Eliot, and for a lot of the writers of that era in the 20th century, like Ezra Pound, and who was Eliot's kind of, I don't know, mentor or patron or something, uh, and it's a real feature that there's a lot more interconnection, I guess, between Western and non-Western literatures than perhaps
Oh,
one tend, the sort of focus on the Western canon, both critical and orthodox, maybe tends to focus on. Keen to ask you, maybe as a kind of a final question. I mean, you studied at Columbia. We just talked about anti-Semitism in Eliot. You talked about people being worried about trigger warnings in Ovid, and we seem to have gone from trigger warnings in Ovid to pretty contentious discussions of much more serious issues of violence in the last few years. And I guess this is a big question, but we here in Australia, around the world, we hear different reports about what's going on at university campuses in the US, and the Margaret Atwood, saying that Trump will bring in Handmaid's Tale sort of situation. A lot of debate about fascism and all that sort of stuff. How would you characterize I guess, the intellectual cultural environment there in America right now? I mean, my sense from you is some of those more extreme views you don't really agree with, but how do you see it?
yeah. So I think there's kind of two things going on. So I think there's a capture of the arts world from the left, and the
Mm,
reaction from the right is kind of, let's just destroy the arts and education and the university system and
mm,
all of this. And neither one is the correct approach, I would
mm,
say.
mm,
And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that this kind of ideological capture has happened by the
mhm,
left, because I think it's just drawn a lot of conservatives away from literature, history, kind
mm,
of what we would think of as the humanities. And, I certainly lean a little bit more conservative, given what is going on in the literary world. And I have a lot of conservative friends, and, about half of which believe that there's very little inherent value in the study of the humanities. And,
mm,
they would just rather go and get their job and work and be successful. And that's all well and good. And I think part of the reason that they hold this belief system is because they see the humanities as synonymous with leftist ideology. And I
mm,
think that it is so unfortunate that that has happened,
mm,
because what that does is, first of all, it doesn't do justice to the humanities. And second of all, it steers a lot of people who actually might be interested in these sorts of things away from that world. And I think the attack from the right is not helpful either,
mm,
because we need the humanities. They're important. And the fact that we have essentially just obliterated the need for literature and culture, and we can have a whole discussion on what AI is doing, right? I see this a
Mm,
lot with my students, right? But yeah, I mean, I think the arts and cultures are under siege here in the US. I think the university system is partially contributing to that, and then the kind of people in power politically right now are also contributing to that. So you have an
mm,
attack from both sides, and I think I'm a big proponent of the kind of classical humanistic tradition, and I think that
mhm,
is ultimately the way forward. And we need to, uh,
mm.
we need to do our best to protect that as much as we can.
Yeah. Yeah, and I personally, I'm very much a pluralist. I think there's value in many points of view, and it's probably best to keep many points of view out there.
Yeah.
So wonderful. And Lisa, maybe also just about Substack and YouTube, because, in a way, it's been a lifeline for you to have a literary life. Other than being an English professor, what's your, do you want to just say a little bit about what your, the possibilities you see on Substack and the other social media like YouTube, etc., that,
Yeah.
that is not just, funny cat videos or, videos about how to do YouTube, but, it's about some broader cultural issues as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Substack has, for me, been just a really, really big lifeline
Mm,
in general, because I haven't had really any opportunity to get my writing out there before Substack.
hmm
And I think it's doing wonderful work in terms of putting new writers on people's radars. Same thing with, I do a lot of work with like YouTube and Instagram. Even it's a different, I would say, sort of audience on kind of the
mm,
social media channels.
mm,
I think I tend to be maybe a little bit less serious on those,
mm.
because if I'm too serious and boring about literature, it just doesn't grab people's attention in the same way. So fine, I tend to
Got
be maybe
five
a little bit
seconds
more
in the
fun.
hook.
You're right. Instagram, I think, is particularly hard in that respect, and
Mm,
I'm playing around with what works on
mhm,
Instagram, but I do have an audience on there
mm,
as well. But I do think that Substack has done so many wonders for my writing career. I've met so many great
mm.
people like yourself through Substack, and I think it fills the space for me of intellectual conversations that I don't get to have since leaving academia.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's a new little republic of letters out there, really, isn't
Oh
it?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Wonderful, Lisa. So, look, I'll include in the video description below, as they say, links to your stuff. But do you want to just maybe remind everyone where they can check out your work on Pens and
Yeah,
Poisons?
absolutely. I'm on pensandpoison.org. And you can also find me on my website, LizaLibes.com. But if you'd like to read my essays, that's on pensandpoison.org. I'm also on YouTube and Instagram under the handle Pens and Poison.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.